Okay, today we have the following agenda. We're going to start with the introduction. We're going to be working on the 5 key points that have been identified in the last session that we had in March of this year. I'm sorry, someone has their microphone open. So the people that were participating at the time identified as relevant. We're going to be dealing with these 5 items. First of all, we're going to be working in groups. We're going to have several groups. Some of you have even registered to participate and share your own experiences. After that, we're going to have a plenary session. We're going to be sharing the outcomes, the results of findings of each of these groups. Then we're going to have some lightning chats. And finally, we're going to deal with the conclusions for this call and the next steps. Next, please. This presentation that you are watching on your screen is going to be shared both in English and Spanish so that you may follow it, please. It's going to be shared on the chat, both in English and in Spanish. I am posting the link for the English version, and my colleague Karen is going to be posting the Spanish version. So please, in order to start the session, please capture this code or click on the link that we just shared in the chat. This code will lead you to 3 initial questions for this session. Fatima, Karen are going to send you the link for this presentation. You don't have to register. Access is free. Access to the platform where you have to answer these 3 questions. So please start answering those questions. Okay, and now we're going to check to see that everyone is replying to the questions. These are 3 questions that we need to have answered before we start the session. Fatima? Yes, maybe I should mention that we're going to start with a participatory dynamic. The first thing that we want to do after Karen Anaya introduced herself is please go to this short survey at Slido. How can you do that? You can do that through the QR code that you can see on your screens, or you can go to Slido's website using the number that you see on your screen. Furthermore, on the chat, my colleague Fatuma has posted the link to Slido's app. We're going to give you a few minutes so that everyone can complete the survey. You're going to find 3 questions. What we're going to do is, after you've made your inputs, your questions to 1, 2, or all 3 questions, we're going to show them on the screen. The idea is also to keep repeating that this is a participatory space, and this is why we want to give the floor to everyone in attendance today. So as you look at the questions and you start answering the survey or filling out the survey, in this case, well, we see that there's an interest from people from more than 25 countries across the world. Of course, we have an emphasis on Latin America and the Caribbean, so we'd like to greet everyone who has joined us today. And again, we're going to provide you with the space. Please answer if you have any comments or questions or as to how to access the survey. Please let us know and we will gladly help you. In the meantime, as you fill in the survey, I'm going to start reading some comments on the chat. People who are greeting us. I see Nicolas Escobar from Data Lab. We have Johanna from the US Embassy in Colombia. I will not be able to read every single message, but I'm going to try to read some of them. Again, we have English-Spanish interpretation for those of you who just joined the session. The instructions are on the chat. I would just like to remind you that you can select either English and or Spanish for the session. Okay, we have a first few responses to question number 1. Do you know anything about global frameworks, not necessarily data, that can contribute to this discussion? Do you know about global frameworks, guides, principles? Not just necessarily data frameworks that can contribute. Again, the Carta Principles, the legislative guide on discrimination from the UN. Also, the legal guidelines on crime from the UN Statistics Division. And yes, in addition, we have the guideline that was released in 2018 in order to measure the level of inclusion of LGBTI plus people. Next question, just to look at. So why do you think a multi-stakeholder approach in LGBTQ plus data is needed? Well, we've looked at several exercises across the region from different organizations in different countries, both at statistical offices, the government sector, civil society. What we're proposing here is a multi-stakeholder approach where we will find joint efforts, joint work. And in response to that, we see that people are saying this is a good option that lets you cross-cut the information in order to provide greater credibility. We've focused on discussions only based on technical aspects. On the other hand, visibility by emphasizing that this is a right, that we should all share public services and goods. Of course, data produced by NSOs are a public good. One more idea that we've been consolidating along these consultations and global discussions is the fact that people should be represented on data, and beyond numbers and figures, there are real life stories to be dealt with. Someone else says, because oftentimes the people less involved are made invisible, or people who have been historically discriminated against, because there are people who identify as LGBTQ plus in conventional operations at households. We're talking about statistical operations and surveys on people. We also know that many times people do not feel comfortable during a face-to-face interview. They don't feel comfortable telling someone about their sexual preferences and or gender-based identity. So we need to gather hard data that will provide for clear public policies. Next question, just in closing this interactive part. The question is, how can a gender and sexuality diversity approach be incorporated into the LGBTIQ plus data agenda we're working on? By listening, by sharing, and by learning. Someone just said, you need to make sure that the terms that have to do with gender and sexuality are properly defined that they reflect diversity within the community. It includes non-binary terms, gender-based, diverse gender-based identities, and sexual orientations beyond the known ones. We should also develop surveys and forums that will let people identify themselves through multiple gender options. We need to ensure that we collect and then we can start going to the next slide in order to start the presentation. Please, even though we're not reading out all of the questions because of time issues and because we have a very busy agenda, we're collecting all of these ideas and answers in order to come out with a proposal of what we're going to do with or about each of the action points that need to be discussed. So please continue to participate to the extent that you may wish to do so. In order to start with an introduction on where we are at this point, because yes, you did get the invitation to an event. We're saying that this is the second event. The second event for what? We've opened up a space, a multi-stakeholder space for dialogue and action toward the creation and implementation of a regional data agenda with the aim of to guarantee human rights of LGBTIQ plus persons under the premise that we need to have better data in order to improve lives, in this case, improving the lives of LGBTI people. At the beginning of this year, at the Global Partnership, together with my colleagues from Red Sin Violencia and Colombia Diversa, we created a partnership to establish this space. The initiative is in line with three areas of work. The first one is to change the rules that govern data and that do not necessarily include discussions and data that take place in technical and number-based environments, but that we need to include different perspectives. The second area of work has to do with making inclusiveness the norm. And when we talk about inclusiveness, we're not only talking about having disaggregated data based on gender-based identity or by sexual diversity. We're talking about processes, inclusive processes involving data where different stakeholders will be part of the production process, beginning by identifying the needs. So it's not just about one group of people deciding what the important questions are in order to characterize people. It is the people themselves in a group that will be participating and saying, hey, for us, this is relevant or this or that. And this includes their participation from the starting phases of the statistics production process. And because of this, it is also one way to further strengthen national and regional data systems by understanding that data are not the ultimate goal. The power of data involves the power for being used and for recognition to the extent that they are used for designing better public policy, hence the power to change lives. Next slide, please. Why is this space relevant? We know that the violation of human rights of LGBTIQ plus persons persists and that more data is needed in order to conduct these characterizations. While there is a mandate for states to gather data on human rights violations against LGBTIQ plus people, the process is not well coordinated with and among diverse actors. And although we acknowledge that a number of regional exercises have been conducted, they are not properly coordinated amongst the different stakeholders. There are still challenges in statistical production and official data to include a gender and sexual diversity perspective. And after those discussions that we've held so far, we called for data production processes to enable the participation on things that may create social impact, and this is the design of public policies. After that, after the first event, and based on the inputs that we've gotten, both during the call, during the event, but previous and later consultations, we've come out with a 5-point agenda that we're going to be looking at next. Next slide, please. Okay, we have a video here before we move on. En años recientes, muchos estados han hecho avances considerables en este aspecto. Prohibir la discriminación, sancionar los delitos homofóbicos y transfóbicos de odio, facilitar que las personas transgénero celebration because the agenda has been shared in Latin America and the Caribbean. En nuestro nuevo blog. Next, please. And next, please. I believe that given time constraints, we should just mention that we're calling for collective reflection under the framework of citizens-generated data, a proposal. And if you want to learn more about citizens-generated data, we encourage you to look at the presentation from the UN Statistics Division during a first event, which you can find on our website. We're going to send you the material by email as well, because this is where official statistics are recognizing the need to incorporate different stakeholders in the production of statistics. So there's a way for the different exercises that are being carried out by civil society or by the government sector will be recognized as official statistics. Of course, we need to abide by a number of frameworks and quality attributes, but this is joint work that we're proposing, and we see a great possibility for having a data framework in both Latin America and the Caribbean for LGBTI plus community in order for them to be recognized in official data. As I was saying at the beginning of the session, we have an interest in more than 20 countries, nearly 20 countries in Latin America, including CARICOM countries. And we've also raised interest globally in other regions such as North America, Europe, and Africa. The biggest interest, because the agenda has been built amongst us all. So we're listening to what you said during the survey when you registered. So we see that there's an interest in exchanging knowledge to build capacities and do advocacy processes. We have one website for the initiative. You can find it on the link for the presentation that we shared with you. And after this pathway that we've read so far, we'll define 5 priority working areas that we're going to be looking at in the next slides. And so the 5 areas of work. Number 1, identify good practices, lessons learned, and challenges from previous measurement exercises of LGBTIQ plus data. Although there's not a regional framework in place, there's not a guide for everyone. It's not that exercises have not been conducted. These exercises, we can compile best practices and lessons learned from them. Item number 2 is learning from global perspectives, as I just mentioned, on citizen-generated data, and formulate and implement an LGBTIQ plus data framework in Latin America and the Caribbean. Number 3 is how to humanize data. In prior discussions, there's been consensus stating that behind the numbers, there are real life stories to be found and that we need to humanize those data. In practice, how are we going to be doing that? This is also a question for you all. What about the proposals? Point number 5, action point number 5 is to promote collaboration between different stakeholders at both the country level and the regional level and the global level in order to guarantee that data produced is available for the purposes of improving the well-being of LGBTIQ plus persons. So we need to ensure that data are not only produced, but we need to make sure that they are posted. We need both public policy makers and the people that are represented on that data will use that data for making decisions. And finally, item number 5, last but not least, identifying opportunities for strengthening capacities on methodologies and other technical purposes in data production purposes, because they have the role of coordinating data production. However, the vision has changed because it used to be that the NSO had the monopoly of statistics production. We're not talking about only about NSOs, but about entire national statistics systems. And under these national statistics systems, the responsibility for data production may also be shared with the different stakeholders. I'm going to stop here at the presentation. If you like further description, you will find it on the file. However, because of time constraints, we're going to straight to the group discussions. Very well. Everyone is coming back from the breakout rooms. And at this time, we're going to have one plenary session on conclusions. Everyone, including me, the moderators for all 5 sessions, that is the breakout rooms, we're going to give you 2 minutes so that you can give your inputs on what you did in your rooms. So I encourage the moderator of group 1 on prior exercises and best practices that were identified 2 minutes so that you can please tell us what was discussed in your room. Thank you. Very well. Thank you, everyone. Actually, this is a challenge summarizing this, but we had a very interesting discussion around this, disaggregation of data regarding gender identity, sexual orientation, science, sex at birth, how to play with these different variables. From Tijuana, Jonathan told us a little bit about their experience and how they have an approach or more qualitative approach, and they do interviews with victims or even with the family members of the victims, and how those interviews begin to join the different perceptions. And on information gathering, we also had a presentation from Colombia's NSO. Alejandra told us about a pilot survey that they're conducting and how that survey is attempting to create umbrella categories or large categories by providing the opportunity to others in order for everyone to be represented. We also had George from Peru. He told us a little bit about how data can become public policy and which kind of data can actually have an impact on public policy. And he was telling us about the experience in Peru, very interesting data about an exercise that they've been conducting since 2016. Lisette also told us about the experience in Ecuador and a little bit more about the approach on the protection of data and creating trust, building trust. So discussion was, and I'm sorry, Gustavo from the network also provided great inputs. If I'm forgetting everyone, we have all the information on the document, but I'm trying to compile as much as I can. We also had Gustavo from La Red. He talked about the it depends and the objective and the why and the what for. This is what we're going to measure as well. So in the end, he proposed a mixed qualitative, quantitative exercise that will actually address the objective. What is the objective and how quantitative and qualitative data can make a big difference? And well, thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, group 2, please. The spokesperson. Yes, very briefly, and let me take the opportunity to say that the discussions don't stop here. We're going to be sharing a summary of this meeting with the links to each of the groups, and we're going to leave these documents open. They're not going to identify anyone. They're going to be anonymized. Anyone can participate in the next few days, maybe 10 days. So time is of the essence because this is a virtual space, but at home you have 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So these data will be made available so that you will be able to share your experiences. And basically, the discussion within group 2 is there are several exercises that have been carried out. DataLat in Ecuador told us about some exercises involving data in several countries across the region, and also in Costa Rica. There are a number of challenges that they're facing that we've identified on how to make them recognized as official data, some methodology-based challenges from the statistics standpoint for representativity and inclusivity. And we were talking about having a regional data framework for LGBTQI plus population, because some people say we don't have this. We need to go to a more proactive approach because number one, we're not starting from scratch because some prior exercises have been conducted. We have lessons learned and identified challenges. Plus, we have a number of frameworks. They may not be enough, but they're benchmarks, considering beginning with the framework of data generated by citizens. This is from the UN Statistics Office, and you can merge official statistics with statistics from other stakeholders. This is a more wide-ranging framework. However, we can bring it in. We have the framework on, or the principles that we have in place on human rights-based data from the Office of the UN High Commissioner. And although this is not enough, and they're just a guideline, the frameworks that have been developed in terms of inclusiveness and gender-based perspectives are quite important. We know that traditionally, throughout the years, several gender-based discussions have taken place, but mainly they have been designed to characterize differences between men and women. They're a guideline, but again, they're not enough for working on gender-based perspectives and sexual identity. Again, I will give the floor to Karen again. Thank you. So now we're going to give the floor to group 3. It is Fatuma who is going to represent this group.
Thank you. So our group had the topic of humanizing data. And so we brought up a couple of points within our group. Some of that including the idea of humanizing data allows us to better identify individuals, but also allows for a full range of identification. We also talked about how humanizing data also allows for better buy-in and trust and accountability mechanisms. We talked about how humanizing data creates cultures of empathy and creates cultures of sharing. We talked about how humanizing data allows us to address the challenges around large-scale statistics and how that links to different societal issues and how that then also links to different policy frameworks. And then we also talked about the idea of humanizing data is really important, specifically in relation to donors and funding allocation or resource allocations. And we talked about sort of challenges around how it's difficult for donors to fund these types of initiatives if there isn't necessarily a humanizing aspect to it. So yeah, I will pause there in the interest of time, and I'll pass back to Karen A.
Thank you, Fatma. Group 4, in fact, I was there. I would like to tell you that within this group, we addressed collaboration between different stakeholders. This is precisely the purpose of this space. We talked with representatives of the state, the Prosecutor General's office, international bodies, and also NGOs. In this case, we have colleagues from Ecuador and Bolivia. Based on different perspectives, we said that it is important to do the work jointly, oftentimes making data official can be achieved whenever state actors are or stakeholders are present during these exercises, and they also having different stakeholders lets you sustain the joint work that may become strengthened whenever it's been created by academia, civil society, or the state. So we talked about the need for spaces to be participatory with regard to the hurdles or the challenges that you usually face. Our colleagues mentioned that there's always a need for discussion on the process of gathering and data presentation. Will bring together LGBTIQ individuals, and we need to take into account that, for example, people who have less access to resources in order to conduct this kind of work are trans people. In this regard, it is also important to identify how there is mistrust, distrust, suspicion within civil society regarding the state in spaces where situations involving biases and discrimination are involved, but also we have authoritarianism experiences. Is one more practice. We need to acknowledge the progress that has been made in terms of the rights recognition, and that this can lead the population to undertake joint work. People who work at multilateral agencies said that we need to work jointly to get to know each other and to understand that there's a need to provide sustainability, both financial, technical sustainability to these spaces, so that everyone can make their own contribution without making others invisible and or making the groups that are more impacted today, that is trans people, become invisible. I'm going to stop here and I'm going to give the floor to the last group, group number 5, led by Betty. Hello, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Those that didn't share with me, I didn't say hello. Our group focused on how to identify opportunities for strengthening capacities, and I'm going to do my best to summarize the conversation. But in general, we identified that there are 3 aspects that need to be taken into account when dealing with the capacities. One is the technical aspect, including variables, quantitative management of this data, improving information systems, but there's also something to do with training, not only a technical aspect, but also understanding the categories. And this also enables the way in which we read and analyze the information that we collect. And finally, one third aspect, which is how do we use data? We have the variables, we've examined the variables, but how do we use this in order to do advocacy within the different state bodies, not only for working with the organizations that produce official data, but also with other institutions that make policies. So we believe that within these 3 aspects, we need to identify these opportunities in order to further strengthen capacities, but not only to think about the capacities within the institutions that generate public data, but also how, I can't remember the word, this data ecosystem can also be used for strengthening civil society organizations. We need to look at this as something, maybe a circular thing. This is a word that I hope that we interpret properly. Everyone should, to their own capabilities, should make their own contributions, both public agencies, civil society. We share the experiences that go beyond the mere statistical production, which one of our colleagues from Nicaragua shared that, for example, when they're dealing with HIV topics, it should be used the medical aspect and the pathologies may be used, but they've worked with civil society organizations in order to reach out to people. And this is something that we might further assess and review. And for example, some surveys with leaders. And this is the way in which these are people who are aware of the community and they can build trust so that the community that they reach out to asking for information will be willing to provide information for these kinds of data collection efforts. Finally, someone shared the importance of creating mechanisms that will enable us to participate and speak with others in a horizontal fashion with data producing agencies, because one challenge is how to create that space for discussion, for a fair or equally based discussion amongst people that know a lot about data generation, that is statistics production institutions, and which would be the best space for articulating these organizations and civil society so that they don't just call civil society to provide information, but just to get them involved. Let me stop there. This is more or less what we discussed. Okay, thank you, colleagues. Let me underscore what Karen Chavez said. Please feel free after we share these documents, our notes, you may continue to provide your opinions and feedback. Now I'll give the floor to Fatma so that we can have a space for the lightning chats that we just mentioned. Fatma, please.
Thank you so much, Karen, and to everyone for sharing their inputs. Just a brief reminder that this portion of the session, some of our speakers will be speaking in English, so please feel free to, in the translation section, toggle over to the Spanish translation if that is your preferred language. So for the next segment, we have two speakers joining us today from different parts of the region, who are going to share some insights around their experiences and their ideas around some of the 5 topics that we discussed across the various rooms. So without any further ado, I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Karen Santee, who is a seasoned professional and has worked in the development sector for 20+ years and is focused on issues around HIV, social determinants of health, human rights, gender and governance, and is currently working with the United Nations Development Program. So I'll pass over to you, Karen, and welcome.
Thank you, Fatima, for the warm introduction, and colleagues, nice to be here. What I'd like to do is to share with you a little bit about the work that we do around data collection within UNDP. So I think to advance data collection on LGBT issues, UNDP has worked at the global, regional, and national level within those spaces. At the global level, we partnered with community representatives, academics, and the World Bank to create the LGBTI Inclusion Index. In 2021, we further developed a training modules related to the index, and we, in 2022, piloted the index in 8 countries. In this region, it was Guyana, Dominican Republic, and Ecuador. Then, in the Latin American region specifically, we have conducted an LGBTI survey covering 5 Central American countries. It was Belize, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, Panama. And then in the Caribbean, we did research on the human rights of intersex persons, as well as national LGBTI surveys in Barbados, Dominican Republic, and Jamaica. But what I really want to highlight is, like, I'm going to take the example of the Dominican Republic survey. I think that survey, we was we brought together LGBTI organizations together with academic institutions to develop the survey instrument. So it was a collaborative process. We worked with civil society organizations in the data collection and in the data validation once the data was collected. That survey results, I'm going to use one example, then we shared the results widely. Our country office colleagues did this with governments, specific government partners, where because the survey covered access to education, health, access to justice. And there was one area that I want to focus on, and it was that we from that survey, which we had participation of more than 7,000 persons. It showed that over 70% of people who were not able to access social protection. And that became important because then during COVID, you know, social assistance programs, if vulnerable communities could not access them. So we followed up based on this results from the survey with the Social Protection Cabinet. And last year we did a series of workshops with the Social Protection Cabinet, bringing LGBTI organizations together with the different agencies. It's CIOBEN, Superate are some of the national agencies in Dominican Republic. And the result of that work was that now we have representation of LGBT organizations on the social cabinet that oversees social protection programs. But also, as you can imagine, there's often a reluctance from members of the communities to engage with government actors. So what we've agreed with CIOBEN is to build the capacity of LGBTI organizations to actually register persons into the social protection system. So I just wanted to say that I think, you know, we don't always get it right. We try to do the data collection, we do it participatory, but I wanted to highlight this example because I think the follow on and what you do and the kind of advocacy work, it should also be jointly in partnership. So what we are doing now under the Being LGBTI project, which is a USAID funded project, we are looking at in Barbados, Guyana, and Jamaica, what are the barriers for trans people to access social protection and the labor market. And then we will provide grants for civil society organizations to do advocacy on the roadmap that's being developed from that research. But I wanted to give you a snapshot. I hope it's helpful. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing some of those remarks and some of the ongoing work that's happening in the Caribbean. If anyone, Karen had mentioned this in the chat as well. If you have any questions for Karen or any comments that you'd like to share with Karen, we're going to be taking a few questions near the end after we hear from our additional speaker as well. So without any further ado, I'd like to also introduce our next speaker, Victor. Victor is joining us today also from the region, and he is a former independent expert for LGBTQI issues at the United Nations. And so, Victor, I'll pass over to you to introduce yourself and share some of the remarks that you have prepared for us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It is, of course, a big pleasure for me and also a lesson to be part of this discussion. I am greeting you also under the conviction that the work that you are doing is a very, very important work, because when I prepared my report on data based on the mandate for independent experts, this is one of the topics that came up more powerfully under the civil society request for the development of standards, the recognition of standards, and the enabling work that UN agencies can conduct. And it seems that is very clear. My friend Karen Santi just explained it very clearly. I'd like to share with you all perhaps 3 thought lines in a very brief manner, of course, under the understanding that the richest part will be that we will be able to have a conversation in which we will also be able to understand what the most interesting aspects will be for you that I could discuss. But the first thing that I like to bring into the context by considering the conversations that you just had is that very recently the General Secretary of the Secretary General of the UN has just issued a strategy for the Secretariat of the UN, a strategy on the implementation of concerns and specific needs from people impacted by violence and discrimination due to their sexual orientation and gender identity. And this overall strategy, very importantly, provides instructions to each of the offices of the UN General Secretary Office to add the principles of inclusiveness, security, safety, and participation into their principles. And this is very important because they are encouraging or asking or requiring the UN Secretariat agencies to ensure the safe participation with content of LGBTIQ plus individuals in their policies that have an impact on them, including the strengthening of partnerships with organizations that represent the interests and that are led by LGBTIQ plus persons. And this is also included that these agencies will have specific approaches on protection, safety, security of not only of these populations, but also of the people around them, the people close to them. And this constitutes a very important baseline in order to establish a conversation regarding the participation of LGBTI and gender diverse people in the programming and the creation and design of the activities of the agencies of the Secretariat. This is a policy, unfortunately, from my point of view, was not formulated to reach out to every single UN agency, but at this time, the Secretary has just launched this for the Secretariat's agencies, but I believe that this is a significant first step. And also based on what Karen discussed, but we can see agencies as UN Women or the Population Fund, the work of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. We know that there are many agencies that have differential approaches when it comes to data. That's the first point that I wanted to share with you. The strategy has been adopted very recently. It was issued maybe 3 weeks ago, and I believe that this is a very significant development for the success of these conversations. On the other hand, I'd like to share with you all that within the architecture of the human rights architecture of the UN, particularly rooted in the work of the High Commissioner for Peace's office, dealing with the treaties and the universal exam, the issue of data collection is something that is now right smack at the core of the discussion, and this is because the work of special agencies and civil society at the political level and dealing with case law of the agencies that are implementing this architecture, a number of standards have been recognized, and this is actually a very significant baseline for continuing to work on this. And particularly, I believe that something highly important is to acknowledge that there is already a significant baseline for what we might call the human rights approach when managing and gathering or dealing with principles and standards that have to do with data. And that through this set of principles and standards, I believe we can further do some very interesting work based on this human rights architecture from the UN with partnerships, for example, with the agencies that are so important as the NSO, National statistics offices, we believe that this is the very next step. When dealing with this topic, we need to keep in mind that, as we all know, and as been discussed this morning, when dealing with data, there are huge dilemmas that the LGBTI populations have to face across the world. For example, globally, the ones created within criminalization settings, because this is a huge challenge, because the state sponsors violence and discrimination in many places in highly politically volatile context, when an election can fully change the context of reliability on how data is managed by state entities, and of course, the powerful role of civil society, that is not only the ones in charge of developing expertise, but the ones that keep the trust of the communities, the people and the populations through systems that have been put in place for decades and that cannot be replicated unless there are very significant processes designed to ensure and build confidence in state agencies, the agencies that are required to safeguard data at the state level. In that context, the third point that I'd like to share with you is that the mandate of the independent expert, when I assumed that role, particularly starting in 2019, it conducted a very significant piece of work because it had great support from civil society entities and also from the states, a work that was designed to get the recognition of standards when dealing with data. And the starting point was a thematic report whereby they started a process that had the involvement of many different civil society organizations and a large number of states as well. More than 90 presentations, inputs, systematic research inputs, and also participation in public consultations by the states, and several meetings by experts and public consultations that were conducted in different regions across the world. The central aspect of the report's conclusions and findings, the due diligence principles, is core to the conclusions of the report, whereby they recognize that states mainly have a duty to protect the rights of everyone at risk of violence and discrimination, and that they need to adopt measures and actions designed to ensure the understanding of the cultural and social stigmas and other causes for violence and discrimination, and that this is part of international responsibility of the states to recognize and acknowledge and have their own level of knowledge about the actual living conditions of the populations and individuals affected by discrimination and violence, particularly due to their sexual orientation and gender identity. And as mentioned here, one essential component of this is the political and methodological principle of recognizing when the specific enforcement of intersection-based approaches. That is to acknowledge that different individuals and agencies have a role to play, because many times people are exposed to high risk of violence and discrimination. In addition to that, one more component that comes from this centralization is that the data entry points do not only have to focus on levels of work dealing with traditionally recognized sectors that are in charge of collecting data when dealing with discrimination and violence. They're still important, but they need to also be expanded to every single sector for social integration, and very importantly, they need to include employment, education, housing, and healthcare, of course. And this is important because they also have to be expanded to data relating to the level of political participation and the level of occupation of public space with full dominion of diversity. And this is important, of course, because it importantly refers to social integration. This report acknowledged 7 essential principles for managing data. The first one of which is do no harm. This is an essential principle across the work of the UN. And again, it proves particularly important not only in criminalization and hostility or deep hostility context. Actually, there are contexts that are possible everywhere across the globe. But very importantly, let me stress this because this is something that concerns me a lot, the political volatility when dealing with data. That is the reality that the issues that have to do with the lives of people, lesbians, trans people, gender diverse people, other people impacted by discrimination and violence based on their social orientation and gender identity. That is that the living realities are so closely linked to the political agenda, and the political instrumentalization creates a high level of risk and volatility whenever an administration changes. And you can have an administration that is particularly open to protecting these communities and individuals and populations, and it can suddenly shift to an administration that base its entire political campaign on attacking these populations and communities, and that they will find an incentive in potentially using data collected by previous administrations in a hostile manner by stigmatizing or even violating the rights, the human rights of these populations. And I believe that this is very important in order to build guarantees and protections within the data systems managed by the states, particularly for the collaboration actions with civil society, because in many cases they require civil society to disclose data and convey data. And of course, civil society has the full legitimacy to require the assurances that this detrimental use will not be made. The second principle, that is self-determination, a principle that we know is particularly being questioned when dealing with gender diverse populations, particularly trans populations. I believe that it is important that we continue to work in that direction. The third principle, the principle of privacy and confidentiality when dealing with data. Number 4, the legal determination of data use, and very importantly, this principle that restricts the use of data for purposes for which they've been that have to do with the international human rights principles that restrict access to data to those agencies and or individuals whose participation is strictly necessary to achieve those goals. Principle number 5, that is participation, has been mentioned today repeatedly. And what I feel is particularly important, something that needs to be stressed, is not only recognizing the expertise of the communities and the organizations that represent them, the individuals who are providing their expertise and in many cases their life experiences, but also the creation of guidelines and ethical frameworks on data use, wherein they will reject and take action to prevent extractive approaches that have to do with data that particularly require the recognition of the investment made by civil society when building approaches, in many cases, decades, entire decades, for designing this experience. Principle number 6, accountability. This principle is derived from a set of legal frameworks, including the right to information, which is one essential component of the freedom of expression, which is connected with Section 19 of the International Pact. Of course, in the context of the Americas, a whole apparatus within the inter-American system. And finally, the principle of impartiality, which requires that agencies that manage statistics will maintain a number of assurances and guarantees dealing with ensuring impartiality. But this trust is fundamental, and this, of course, includes the freedom from internal and external political pressure and an appropriate allocation of human and physical resources to these agencies. And I believe that in our region, this is still a significant challenge because of several reports that we have about the politicization of statistics agencies at both the local and regional level. Colleagues, Karen. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'd like to thank you, of course, for any subsequent discussions. And of course, I will always be at your disposal for any subsequent discussions that we may have on this or any other matters.
Thank you so much, Victor. Really, really appreciated, and for sharing some of those insights that you just presented. We have one final speaker. We also recognize that we are at time of the session, and so we are hoping to wrap up within the next 15 minutes after just hearing from one of our last speakers. And again, if you have any questions for anyone, please feel free to add them in the chat. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our final speaker, who is Eric Nandwala from Uganda. He is here joining us today to provide a bit of a global perspective, but also a perspective from his respective country in Uganda. He is the co-founder and executive director of Lifeline Youth Empowerment, which is an LGBTQ plus rights organization that's based in Uganda. So Eric, I will pass over to you, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Fatuma, for you can confirm whether I can be able to hear me. I cannot be able to put on my camera. In Uganda, there's load shedding. This is Uganda anyway. But allow me to, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to speak to you all, but also thank everyone who has been able to make it here. I think I'm not really going to waste a lot of time because there are so many people that have spoken to most of the things that I would love to highlight on. However, my emphasis is just going to be on why citizen-generated data sometimes is the only option for LGBTQ people, like those that are living in communities. Those that are living in community are those that are living in communities like Uganda, where you're criminalized and where you're continuously persecuted. In Uganda specifically, you find ourselves at a wormhole where the government is saying that there's no violations of LGBTQ people. And it's not because there's no violations, it's because they are not willing to collect that kind of data that speaks to that fact. So the only option that you have within that moment is you as a community, you as civil society, you as the LGBTQ movement to be able to collect that data that speaks to what you are trying to say. So citizen-generated data becomes our only option because at the end of the day, if we have a law like the Anti-Homosexuality Act back here in Uganda, We do not have, the government is not willing for the international community to get to know what it's doing, because at the end of the day, they have been put at a cartel of, the funding being behind, but all that. Today, we just launched a report as the Convening for Equality, and the report highlighted um, the different violations that are happening, from gay men to lesbian men, to lesbian women, to transgender women, to different people of the LGBT community. But the challenge is that whereas we are collecting this data and we are able to verify these cases, is the government even willing to sit down on a table, have a conversation around this data and around the fact that there are people behind these numbers and there are people who are being affected by this law? So we also have an opportunity that whereas we have collected the data, how do we then use the data after that? As communities on a local level, sometimes our platforms are limited. The platforms that we have to be able to speak to the data that we've collected are limited to either speaking to ourselves within the civil society, organizing, but where are the opportunities to be able to speak to the people who are in power, the people who are going to make a decision to change things back home? Sometimes that opportunity is not there. So that's why also when we collect this data, we need to know that this data is very, very verifiable, but most importantly, it can be used by even individuals who are saying, or they are trying to demystify the fact that LGBT people are at risk for the laws that are happening, or the discrimination, the stigma happening within the different concepts of the country. I think also humanizing data is important. Sometimes as data collectors, we also forget that while we are collecting this data, we are collecting it from people that have been traumatized. And sometimes we get to tell their story in ways that might not reflect the reality that they're going on as communities. So sometimes we find ourselves in a position where they're not willing to provide their stories anymore, because some data collectors have decided that when they're having these conversations, what matters is the story, but what about the person that you're collecting the data from? So, from my perspective as an individual, but also as a community, I feel like every time we're speaking about these issues, but also collecting data specifically around violations and people who are living every day in a very traumatizing situation because of being discriminated, because of having fear looming all over them, we need to give them the assurance that their data is not going to be misused, the assurance that their data is not going to be in the wrong hands, and tomorrow they're going to find themselves outed or without knowing that data has landed into the government's arms. I think we have a responsibility to also create awareness on why this is important. We are coming from a background in my country where there's bias on collecting data, because people who have collected data have not come back. They have not spoken back to the communities that they are collecting the data from. And only you see them collecting the data from you, but then tomorrow they're not coming back for accountability. And this is what Victor also mentioned earlier. There is nothing more important than getting trust from the communities that you're collecting data from, especially if you show them that even when it's not going to benefit you directly as an individual, it's benefiting the community. So where do we get the buy-in from? From the start, from the design of of whichever question that you want to collect the data from. Have people been able to put in their input there? But do they even feel that their voices matter, but not your narrative just being taken over? I think we have a responsibility as activists, as people who love data, but also people who believe that data is really going to change things, but also having a seat at the table that we're going to discuss these stories. Most importantly, tell them in a way that humanizes us, that tells the story that we're going through as individuals. I think, in my opinion, if we do this, we might have a chance of, first of all, having LGBTQ authentic voices heard, but most importantly, having narratives changed, having them protected by the state, but also changing discrimination and also changing perceptions of the minds. So many times when we are bombarded questions like, where is the data? Where are they? We cannot see them. Are they invisible? Know that. But if we have verifiable data, usable data, and accessible data that you can be able to provide, putting in head the security and being so mindful about the safety of the people that you're collecting the data from, we have a chance. I don't want to spend out of time because I see we have run out of time. However, I just want to say one thing. The data has the power right now, and whoever has the data has the power. They have the power and they have the man. It's time that the communities take over the role of taking ownership of their own data by learning the skills on the different levels, on the different types of data, and how best to use the data. Because collect our data, we own our data, and then we can be able to share the narrative, direction that as community want to change it. Every time we allow other people to collect our data on our behalf, they'll tell it the way they want to tell it. They'll tell the stories the way they are seeing them from their own perspective. Does that speak to us? Just a question to think about. Thank you so much. I'd love to give it to you back. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for your presentation. Well, before we go to the next steps, we're going to open up the space for questions and answers. There was a question for Karen on where can you find more information on the exercises that she described in the Caribbean. There's a link on the chat, and I'd just like to confirm, is there anything else, Karen, that you want to add before we go to the next stage?
Nothing at the moment to add, but happy to answer questions if there are any.
Perfect, thank you. Just one on the chat. There's one more for Victor. So it says, I'd like to ask Victor precisely on administration changes. Are there any proposals on sensible data security whenever there's a pro-human rights government, but there's no assurance that the next one will act the same ways in order for us to take action that will not become a risk in the future? So Victor, I don't know if you have any comments on the question. Yes, I think, well, thank you for the question. A very important topic. I believe that this is topic. Those of us who are working in this space, we have an essential role of, first of all, identifying risk. And number two, identifying any action that can be taken in order to prevent and mitigate that risk. I am not aware of, at this point, I'm not aware of any specific system or scheme that includes all of these assurances and guarantees, but I believe that systems that try to ensure the compliance and enforcement of these standards have been developed in line with experts from civil society. These are the systems and schemes that come closer to assuring those guarantees. And very importantly, and first of all, number one is the democratic control and monitoring of a proper legislative framework that will define the use of data and any guarantees surrounding it. And number two, the depolitization of the agencies that manage data. You see, in here, there's one example that I like to mention because I believe it's quite representative, is the example of trans populations providing services within the US military, the armed forces, during the President Obama's administration, based on a progressive policy dealing with the recognition of the rights. They self-identified a large number of people. It is estimated that 10,000 trans people are currently serving in the US Armed Forces. And when the administration switched to the Trump administration, the second executive order issued by President Trump was an order prohibiting trans people from serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. And this immediately led to the clearest example of this kind of damage that an individual can suffer. Someone that is providing their information, they identify, they register into a system, and there's an immediate backlash after a switch in the administration, and the new administration will use this information against them. In the context of the United States, the situation never really took place because the executive order was questioned and it was not enforced. However, this is a clear example that leads all to reflection. The second example that I have is a very sad example, something that I heard during one of my consultations in an African country when I was preparing my report on data, wherein an organization told me that after an election where the party that won based their entire platform on persecuting LGBTI individuals, on that same day of the election, the organization began to burn out 25 years of data. And on the next day, it was no longer able to become proof in any criminal proceedings against that organization, because based on the policies put in place by the new administration, they decided that information on LGBTI topics is banned because this could lead to criminal prosecution or actions. And so this is dealt with very differently in different contexts. There are contexts that involve high risk, particularly for the people that provide the data and the people that manage data. And I believe that the essential thing is for civil society and experts, and just as everyone in this call, do not only build expertise, but they have lots of influence on public policy. We need to be clear that there's a whole lot to do when demanding guarantees before data can be conveyed or provided to state entities that manage it under different programs when it comes to political integration and when dealing with violence. Thank you. Okay, Victor, I believe that there are no additional questions. Again, we'd like to thank our three speakers, Karen, Victor, Eric. Thank you so much for joining. Eric, we know that you're in Uganda and the time difference is big, so additional thanks for joining us. Next steps, as I just mentioned, this is a constructive space. So the first thing is to, again, we're going to be reviewing together with my colleagues, Karen and Fatuma, the outcome of this meeting, the initial ideas. There are people who have written us, emailed us because they were unable to join, but they're ready to get the video. So the documents from the breakout rooms will be shared via email. We're going to wait a couple of weeks in order to do that, and then we will continue to plan out a number of events. One of the first things that we saw is that people want more peer exchanges to take place. So also we're going to hold more peer exchanges. We're going to provide more time for more conversations because time is limited and we had to shut off the breakout rooms. You also get a survey after the event, and if you have any additional comments, please remember you can write us 24/7. So we'll be here. We'll have the event on the initiative on the World Data Forum in Medellin. This is a in-person event. We hope that we will take the findings to that event, although it is just one more event within the statistics world. We're going to emphasize everything that we've been dealing with, and we're going to emphasize on civil society organizations, and human rights institutions that are providing their additional perspective and expertise, which is so necessary for building data on LGBTIQ plus communities. Again, thank you so much. And this is all for now. Have a great day. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. See you soon. Thank you.